The amber liquid in Commander Zekthor's glass trembled as another round of artillery shook Kepler Station's foundations. The heavy blast doors rattled in their frames, and dust fell from the reinforced ceiling like snow. Around the crowded military cantina, soldiers from a dozen different species celebrated their latest victory against the hive swarms. The air was thick with smoke from various alien substances, and the sound of clinking glasses mixed with roars of laughter in half a dozen languages. Zekthor sat at the center table, his massive frame dwarfing the reinforced metal chair beneath him. His dark green scales caught the flickering light from the overhead lamps, and his forearms rested casually on the scarred table surface. Despite the celebration around him, his golden eyes remained calm and distant, as they always did after battle. "To Zekthor," roared Lieutenant Vexmal, a stocky Carillion with purple skin and too many teeth. He raised his drink high above his head, causing the other soldiers to turn their attention toward their table. The only warrior in the entire Galactic Defense Force who's never known fear. The cantina erupted in cheers. Soldiers from every corner of known space raised their glasses toward the Thraxian commander. Some banged their fists on tables, others howled battle cries in their native tongues, and a few of the younger recruits actually stood on their chairs to get a better look at the legend himself. Zekthor's scale features remained completely still as his comrades cheered. His service record was the stuff of military legend. 300 battles across 40 different worlds. Never a retreat, never a moment of hesitation, even when facing the galaxy's most terrifying enemies. He had stared down acid-spitting void crawlers without blinking. He had charged through plasma storms that melted lesser warriors where they stood. When the nightmare creatures from the Dark Nebula had driven entire fleets to madness with their psychic screams, Zekthor had simply adjusted his helmet's audio filters and kept fighting. "Come on, Commander," called out Sergeant Crowvass from across the table, his 6 insectoid eyes gleaming with curiosity. "Tell us about the worst enemy you've ever faced. The bone crushers on Titan 7? Those shadow things that could walk through walls?" Other soldiers leaned forward, eager to hear another war story from their hero. Zekthor had faced every nightmare the galaxy could throw at him, and lived to tell about it. His tales were legendary, passed down through military academies and whispered around campfires on distant battlefields. "Actually," said a young Zentari private, her blue skin flushed with alcohol, "I heard a rumor that the humans might finally join our war effort. Command's been in talks with their government for months now." The mention of humans caused a stir around the table. Most species in the Galactic Defense Force had heard stories about the newcomers from a small blue world in the Outer Rim. They were apparently just discovering faster-than-light travel, barely qualified to be considered a spacefaring civilization. Humans? Vexmal laughed, his purple face turning darker with amusement. Those primitive apes? What could they possibly contribute to a real war? "I heard they still use chemical explosives," chuckled another soldier. "And their weapons are so crude, they actually fire metal projectiles instead of energy beams." "Commander," Sergeant Crowvass said, turning his attention back to Zekthor, "what would you do if those humans finally join our war effort? Would you even bother training them, or just keep them to rear with supplies?" The question hung in the air like smoke. Around the table, soldiers waited for their commander's response with the same anticipation they might show for a good joke. Some were already grinning, expecting Zekthor to dismiss the humans with his characteristic dry humor. But the cantina fell silent when they saw the change in their commander's expression. Zekthor stared into his drink for a long moment. His golden eyes seemed to focus on something far away, something none of them could see. When he finally spoke, his voice was quiet but carried clearly through the sudden stillness. "Humans," he said slowly, as if tasting each word, "are the only species that truly terrifies me." The silence that followed was so complete that even the background noise of the cantina seemed to fade away. Soldiers who had been laughing moments before now sat frozen with their drinks halfway to their lips. The young Zentari private's mouth fell open in shock. Then nervous laughter began to ripple through the group, starting with Vexmal and spreading to the others. It was a kind of uncomfortable laughter that people make when they're not sure if they've heard a joke or witnessed something deeply disturbing. "Surely you're joking, Commander," Vexmal said, but there was uncertainty creeping into his voice. You've never been afraid of anything. The void crawlers, the plasma wraiths, even those things that ate the Seventh Fleet. Nothing makes you flinch. Zekthor slowly raised his golden eyes to meet those of his lieutenant. In that gaze, Vexmal saw something he had never seen before in all their years of fighting together. Not fear exactly, but a kind of deep, respectful wariness that made his purple skin go cold. I have never been more serious, Zekthor said simply. 3 years ago, during the Proxima Offensive, I was assigned to a joint operation. Zekthor began, his voice cutting to the cantina's stunned quiet. The other soldiers leaned forward, their drinks forgotten as they waited to hear what could possibly scare their fearless commander. Command told me I'd be working with a new species that had just joined the galactic community. Humans, they called them, fresh out of their home system, barely knew how to operate standard military equipment. Zekthor's golden eyes grew distant as he remembered. I expected to meet another typical spacefaring species. You know the type. Logical, predictable, following standard military doctrine to the letter. He paused to take a slow sip of his drink, and the amber liquid seemed to glow in the dim cantina light. I figured I'd spend most of my time teaching them basic combat formations and keeping them out of trouble. Maybe they'd be useful for carrying supplies or manning communication posts. Vexmal nodded knowingly, like when we first worked with the Altarians. Took weeks just to teach them proper weapon handling. Exactly what I thought would happen, Zekthor continued. But when our transport landed on Proxima 3, the first thing I noticed was the noise. Every other species sets up camp quietly, efficiently. The humans were laughing, in the middle of a war zone, surrounded by enemies that could tear them apart, and they were actually laughing. The Thraxian commander set down his glass and flexed his claws unconsciously. Their sergeant, a man named Mike Collins, had arms covered in scars and eyes that never stopped moving. He walked up to me, looked up at my 8-foot frame, and said, "You must be the lizard they sent to babysit us." Not commander or sir, just the lizard. He insulted you? Krelvass asked, his insect-like mandibles clicking in surprise. That's what I thought at first. But then he grinned and stuck out his hand for me to shake. Turns out it was their way of showing friendship. They call it giving someone grief, and apparently it means they like you. Zekthor shook his massive head slowly. I should have realized then that these weren't like any species I'd ever met. The cantina had grown so quiet that the distant sound of artillery seemed louder than before. Soldiers from a dozen different worlds sat transfixed, trying to imagine their invincible commander being confused by alien humor. The real shock came during our first engagement, Zekthor continued. We were supposed to clear out a hive nest that had burrowed into an old mining facility. Standard operation. Go in, eliminate the threats, secure the area. But 20 minutes into the mission, our plasma weapons started malfunctioning. Some kind of interference from a mining equipment. He gestured with one of his forehands, painting the scene for his audience. Any other species would have called for new equipment or retreated to regroup. Instead, I watched Sergeant Collins and his squad tear apart their medical supplies and ration packs. They were building something with their bare hands, right there in the middle of enemy territory. Building what? Asked the young Zentari private, her blue eyes wide with curiosity. Explosives. They turned bandages into fuses, mixed chemicals from their first aid kits, and somehow created bombs that were more effective than our military-grade plasma charges. Zekthor's voice carried a note of amazement that his comrades had never heard before. When I asked Collins how he knew how to do that, he just shrugged and said his grandfather had taught him during something called camping trips. The soldiers around the table exchanged glances. Making explosives from medical supplies sounded insane, but if Zekthor said it worked. But that wasn't the strangest part, the commander continued. Halfway through the mission, their captain, Tom Bradley, got caught in a hive acid spray. The stuff melted right through his armor and burned deep into his shoulder. Any rational being would call for immediate medical evacuation. Zekthor's claws tapped against his glass again, the sound sharp and rhythmic. Instead, the humans got angry, not frustrated or concerned like you'd expect from professional soldiers. They got genuinely furiously angry, as if the hive creatures had personally insulted them by daring to wound their leader. "But that's completely illogical," protested Krelvass, his 6 eyes blinking rapidly. "Emotion compromises tactical thinking. It leads to mistakes, unnecessary risks." "That's exactly what I thought," Zekthor replied, and for the first time since beginning his story, he smiled slightly. "I was standing there watching what I assumed would be a complete disaster. Angry soldiers making emotional decisions in combat. It should have been a massacre." He leaned forward, and his golden eyes seemed to glow in the cantina's dim light. "Until I realized I was watching a species that didn't just fight to survive. They fought as if losing was a personal insult to their entire bloodline. And somehow, that made them more dangerous than any enemy I'd ever faced. Most species wage war for resources, territory, or survival," Zekthor continued, his audience hanging on every word. The cantina had become so quiet that even the bartender had stopped cleaning glasses to listen. "We fight because we have to, because our planets need protection, or because someone invaded our space, or because treaties require it." He gestured toward the reinforced viewport showing the battle-scarred surface of Kepler Station. Through the thick transparent steel, they could see the twisted remains of hive structures scattered across the landscape like broken bones. Humans waged war out of spite. Several soldiers shifted uncomfortably in their seats. The word spite didn't translate well into most galactic languages, and the concept seemed almost alien to species that approach warfare as a necessary but logical endeavor. "I learned this during my second day with a human unit," Zekthor said, his 4 hands moving expressively as he spoke. "We were pinned down in an abandoned factory by hive warriors. The creatures had us surrounded, and our position was being slowly dissolved by their acid spit. Standard procedure would be to call for artillery support and wait for extraction." He paused to take another sip of his drink, letting the tension build. "But I watched Private Jack Murphy continue fighting with 2 broken ribs and a shattered arm. His weapon was damaged, his armor was cracked, and green blood was leaking from multiple wounds. Any rational soldier would have reported to the medic immediately." "What did he do instead?" asked Vexmal, though from his tone, he wasn't sure he wanted to know the answer. When our field medic finally reached him and ordered him to fall back for treatment, Murphy looked at her like she was crazy. He said, and I quote exactly, "These bugs aren't going to kill themselves." Then he picked up a piece of broken metal and kept fighting. Zekthor shook his massive head slowly, not because he had to, not because retreat was impossible, but because the idea of those creatures continuing to exist personally offended him. A few nervous chuckles echoed to the cantina, but they sounded forced and uncomfortable. The soldiers were beginning to understand that their commander wasn't telling them a funny story. Their medic was almost as disturbing. Zekthor continued. Dr. Kate Williams was supposed to be a healer, focused on saving lives and treating wounded. But when her plasma rifle got hit by acid spray and stopped working, she didn't just find another weapon. The Thraxian commander leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his massive weight. She took apart the broken rifle, then somehow combined it with components from a coffee maker and a communications array she found in the factory office. The energy matrices were completely incompatible. According to everything I know about technology, what she was trying to do should have resulted in a massive explosion that killed us all. "But it worked?" asked Krelvass, his mandibles clicking nervously. "Not only did it work, she made it function at 150% normal capacity. The improvised weapon was actually more powerful than the original." Zekthor's golden eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. When I asked her how she knew it would work, she just shrugged and said, "I didn't, but I figured the worst thing that could happen was we'd all die quickly instead of slowly." The silence that followed was heavy with implications. Most species valued life above all else, especially their own. The idea of risking everyone's survival on a dangerous experiment just to spite the enemy was almost incomprehensible. "But what truly unnerved me was their morale," Zekthor said, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "We Thraxians maintain discipline through duty and honor. The Carillions fight for family and tradition. The Zentari believe in sacrifice for the greater good." He gestured around the table, at his mixed group of comrades. Every species I've served with has logical reasons for maintaining courage in battle. Humans maintain theirs by making jokes about their own deaths. Jokes. The young Zentari private looked confused. About dying? Private Ben Foster actually started a betting pool on whether the hive acid would dissolve his helmet before or after he ran out of ammunition. Zekthor said he was taking bets from other soldiers while acid was literally eating through the walls around us. When someone pointed out that he'd be dead either way, he just laughed and said, "Yeah, but at least I'll win the bet." The cantina erupted in uncomfortable murmurs. Soldiers exchanged glances, trying to process the idea of finding humor in such a situation. They sang songs while they fought. Zektor continued, his voice growing stronger. Not war chants or battle hymns like civilized species use to maintain formation. They sang something called drinking songs and folk music. One of them was humming a tune about lost love while using a broken pipe to beat hive warriors to death. He stood up slowly, his massive frame casting long shadows across the table. I realized that day that I was witnessing something completely unique in the galaxy, a species that had somehow turned spite into a military advantage. They don't fight harder when they're losing. They fight harder when they're annoyed. The real revelation came during the siege of Mining Station Omega 7. Zekthor's voice grew quieter, forcing his audience to lean in closer. The cantina was so silent now that they could hear the distant rumble of cargo ships landing on the station's docking bays. That was when I truly understood what I was dealing with. He stared down at his drink, and for a moment his golden eyes seemed to reflect something that might have been fear. The intelligence reports had been wrong. What we thought was a small hive outpost turned out to be a major breeding facility. We were supposed to face maybe 500 creatures. Instead, we found ourselves surrounded by overwhelming hive forces. 10,000 creatures against our combined unit of 300 soldiers. The numbers hung in the air like a death sentence. Every soldier in the cantina understood military mathematics. Those odds meant certain death for everyone involved. The hive had us completely surrounded. Zektor continued, his voice barely above a whisper. They controlled all the high ground, all the escape routes, and they had unlimited reinforcements streaming in from underground tunnels we didn't even know existed. Our orbital support couldn't reach us because of some kind of electromagnetic interference from the mining equipment. He paused, letting his audience imagine the hopeless situation. I gathered my officers to discuss terms for surrender. In Thraxian military tradition, when facing impossible odds, an honorable surrender can save the lives of your troops. Better to live as prisoners and die uselessly. Vexmal nodded grimly. Most galactic species had similar traditions. Pointless death served no one. But when I called the human officers over to discuss our options, they looked at me like I was speaking a foreign language. Zekthor said, Corporal Luke Harrison, a young man who couldn't have been more than 25 in human years, listened to my explanation of our tactical situation. Then he turned to his squad and announced, Well, lads, looks like we're about to become famous. The Thraxian commander shook his head slowly, as if he still couldn't believe what happened next. Then they began laughing. Not the nervous laughter of soldiers trying to hide their fear. Genuine, amused laughter. And they started betting on who could kill the most bugs before breakfast. That's complete madness, Vexmal said, his purple skin growing pale. Facing certain death and making jokes about it? That's exactly what I thought, Zektor replied. I watched them check their weapons and equipment with the same casual attitude they might use to prepare for a training exercise. One of them, Private Danny Walsh, was actually disappointed because he'd forgotten to bring extra ammunition. Not scared. Disappointed. The cantina was so quiet now that the sound of Zektor's claws tapping against his glass seemed unnaturally loud. I assumed I was watching the psychological breakdown of an entire unit, mass hysteria or something similar, but their actions were completely organized and tactical. He stood up slowly, his massive frame casting shadows across the table. When our ammunition began running low, most species would attempt to conserve what they had left or look for alternative defensive positions. The humans switched to melee combat without any hesitation. not with resignation or grim determination, but with genuine enthusiasm. "They preferred close combat?" asked Krelvass, his insect-like eyes blinking rapidly. "They seem to enjoy it," Zektor said, and his voice carried a note of wonder. "I watched them turn mining tools into weapons, use broken furniture as shields, and coordinate attacks with nothing but hand signals and shouted jokes. Their medic, a slight human female named Lieutenant Beth Taylor, did something that still gives me chills when I think about it." He sat back down, leaning forward across the table. She took her medical scanner, the device meant to diagnose injuries and monitor vital signs, and started using it to identify hive weak points. Then she began systematically hunting the largest creatures in the facility with nothing but a surgical laser. The soldiers around the table exchanged incredulous looks. Medical personnel were supposed to stay behind the lines, treating wounded and coordinating evacuation procedures. "A surgical laser?" the young Zentari private asked. "Those things are designed for precision work on tissue samples. They barely have enough power to cut through skin. That's what made it so terrifying," Zektor said. She was using a tool meant for healing to become one of the most effective killers on the battlefield. And the whole time she was doing it, she was humming. Several voices asked the question simultaneously. Some kind of human melody. Something soft and peaceful, completely at odds with the carnage around her. She would scan a creature, identify its vulnerable spots, then methodically burn through them with surgical precision while humming like she was working in a hospital. Zekthor's golden eyes seemed to glow in the dim light. I asked her later what the song was about. She said it was called Amazing Grace, and it was about finding peace in difficult times. The silence that followed was profound. None of the alien soldiers could process the image of someone humming peacefully while surrounded by death and violence. That's when I realized I was witnessing something completely unique in galactic history, Zektor concluded. A species that had somehow weaponized optimism itself. They weren't just refusing to accept defeat. They were treating certain death like a challenging game they were determined to win. The cantina remained completely silent as Zektor finished his tale about the humming medic. The only sounds were the distant rumble of machinery and the occasional clink of ice settling in forgotten drinks. Every soldier in the room was trying to process what they had just heard about humans turning certain death into some kind of twisted competition. "My fear isn't of human hostility," Zektor said finally, breaking the heavy silence. His golden eyes swept across the faces of his comrades, seeing confusion and disbelief written there. "Any species can be hostile. The void crawlers are hostile. The plasma wraiths are hostile. I've learned to deal with hostility." He stood slowly, his imposing 8-foot frame casting long shadows across the table in the dim cantina light. "My fear is of their complete unpredictability and their apparent immunity to despair. Every military manual in the galaxy assumes that all intelligent species have certain psychological limits, points where morale breaks down, where self-preservation takes over, where retreat becomes the only rational choice." Zektor gestured with one of his 4 hands, and his claws caught the flickering light. Every other species in the galaxy has logical breaking points. Points where even the bravest warriors will say, "This is impossible," and withdraw to fight another day. It's not cowardice. It's basic survival instinct. Humans view these breaking points as personal challenges to overcome. The weight of that statement settled over the room like a heavy blanket. Vexmal opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again, apparently unable to find words for what he was thinking. "Let me finish the story about Mining Station Omega 7, Zektor continued, pacing slowly around the table. "Remember, we were facing 10,000 hive creatures with only 300 soldiers. By every military calculation ever made, we should have lasted maybe 20 minutes before being completely overrun." He paused beside the reinforced viewport, looking out at the battle-scarred landscape beyond. The siege lasted 14 hours. 14 hours of continuous combat against impossible odds. And during those 14 hours, I watched something that changed my understanding of warfare forever. "What happened?" asked the young Zentari private, her blue skin pale with anticipation. Captain Tom Bradley, the human officer who had been wounded in the acid attack, refused medical treatment for the entire battle. He was still bleeding from wounds that would have hospitalized any other species, but he spent those 14 hours coordinating attacks and keeping morale high. Zekthor's voice carried a note of amazement. Near the end, when the final hive wave was approaching and our defensive positions were completely destroyed, he looked at the approaching swarm and said, "Right then, who's ready to make some noise?" The Thraxian commander turned back to face his audience. They didn't just survive that battle. They won it so decisively that the hive forces retreated from the entire system. 300 soldiers, mostly human, defeated 10,000 creatures that had been terrorizing that sector for months. How? Krelvass asked, his mandibles clicking nervously. The numbers don't make sense. Because humans don't fight by the numbers, Zekthor explained. They fight by spite, stubbornness, and an absolute refusal to accept that anything is truly impossible. When conventional weapons failed, they used mining equipment. When the mining equipment broke, they used furniture and debris. When they ran out of debris, they used their bare hands. He walked back to his chair, but didn't sit down. Instead, he placed one massive hand on the table and leaned forward. But the most terrifying part was what happened after battle. When the hive forces finally retreated and we were counting our casualties, the humans were already planning their next attack. They weren't thinking about rest or recovery. They were angry that some creatures had escaped. Lieutenant Beth Taylor, the medic with the surgical laser, actually complained that the battle ended too soon. She said she was just getting warmed up. Zekthor shook his head slowly. I realized then that I wasn't just fighting alongside a different species. I was fighting alongside a different kind of existence entirely. He finally sat back down, his golden eyes reflecting the cantina's dim lights. Every other species has limits. Physical limits, psychological limits, technological limits. When we reach those limits, we adapt our tactics or find alternative strategies. Zekthor raised his glass, and the amber liquid seemed to glow in the flickering light. Humans have suggestions. They treat limits like mild recommendations that can be ignored if the situation is interesting enough. And that, my friends, is why they terrify me. Because when you fight alongside them, you begin to believe that impossible is just another word for Tuesday. The silence that followed was different from before. Where there had been confusion and disbelief, now there was a kind of awed understanding. The soldiers around the table were beginning to grasp what their commander was really telling them. Finally, Lieutenant Vexmal slowly raised his own glass, his purple skin flushed with something that might have been excitement or terror. "Commander, I formally request human reinforcements for our next mission." One by one, the other soldiers joined him, raising their drinks in a silent toast to a species they were only beginning to understand. Sergeant Krelvass, the young Zentari private, even the bartender who had been listening from across the room, all of them raised their glasses toward their commander. Zekthor smiled then, a genuine expression of warmth and anticipation. It was the first time his comrades had ever seen such an expression on his scarred, battle-hardened face. "Already approved, Lieutenant," he said, and his voice carried the satisfaction of a secret finally revealed. "We deploy with the human 42nd Shock Regiment at dawn.